The unexpected discovery. Dr. James Lawson had always prided himself on his sense of duty. As a seasoned pediatrician in the small town of Ashton, he felt a deep commitment to the community and the children he cared for. His days, though often long and tiring, were filled with purpose. But nothing, not even the most challenging medical case or the toughest of patients, could have prepared him for what he was about to find that afternoon. James had just wrapped up his final appointment at the clinic when he decided to take a short walk through the park near his office. He felt the need to clear his mind. The stress of the day, of dealing with the usual rounds of sick children, anxious parents, and paperwork, was starting to take its toll. The air was crisp, and the trees lining the park had just started to turn shades of gold and red, signaling the arrival of autumn. The park was mostly quiet, save for the sound of distant laughter from a group of children playing on the swings. James admired the simple beauty of it all, the peaceful serenity of the place, before his thoughts drifted back to the conversation he'd had with Margaret that morning. They had discussed, yet again, their struggles to have children of their own. Their hearts ached from the years of disappointment, but they had learned to cope with the emptiness. It was a burden they carried together. Margaret had her writing, and James had his patience, but there was always a quiet longing that tugged at their hearts. As he walked further along the park's winding path, he began to hear something faint. At first, he assumed it was just the wind rustling the leaves or the chatter of the children. But then it came again, a soft, almost inaudible cry, a whimper that seemed to echo through the stillness of the afternoon. His heart skipped a beat. The sound was unmistakable now. It was the cry of a baby. James's first instinct was to follow the sound, and he did so without a second thought. The park was relatively empty at this time of day, and he couldn't imagine who would leave a baby here. He rounded the corner near an old rusted trash can, half hidden behind some overgrown bushes. The faint crying was louder now, and it pulled him toward the can. His stomach churned as he approached the trash can, a strange mix of dread and urgency washing over him. The area around the bin was cluttered with discarded food wrappers, empty bottles, and old newspapers. It was a desolate spot, hardly the place where one would expect to find a child. But there, amidst the pile of rubbish, he spotted something that made his heart stop. A small bundle, no larger than a loaf of bread, was nestled amidst the trash. As James drew closer, his eyes widened in disbelief. It was a baby, a tiny, fragile infant, abandoned without a second thought. She was wrapped in a tattered piece of cloth, her skin pale from the cold, her cries weak and pitiful. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was no ordinary case of neglect. It was the tragic consequence of someone's cruelty. A baby, left to die in the most inhumane way. James couldn't comprehend it. How could anyone do this to a helpless child? His pulse quickened as he knelt beside the trash can, his mind racing through medical protocols. The child's skin was cold to the touch, a sure sign of hypothermia. He could feel the rapid, shallow breaths she was taking as she struggled to cling to life. There was no time to waste. His instincts as a doctor kicked in. Without a second thought, James gently scooped the baby into his arms, holding her as close as he could, trying to warm her with his body heat. His hand shook with a mix of fear and anger. Who would abandon such a small, defenseless life? But the why of it didn't matter now. All that mattered was getting her to safety. As he rushed toward the nearest phone booth, he felt the baby's tiny form trembling in his arms. He could see the remnants of dried blood around her tiny wrists, signs of her fragile existence and the harsh life she had already faced. There was something about her that made him feel like he needed to protect her, not just as a doctor, but as a human being. The urgency in his steps increased with every second that passed. James dialed 911 with trembling fingers, his voice coming out steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. He explained the situation, his voice almost distant as he gave the location. It seemed surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The operator's calm and professional response gave him little comfort as he heard the sirens wail in the distance, drawing closer. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be wrong with the child. Was she dehydrated? Could she have been neglected for longer than he could imagine? Was there a chance she wouldn't survive this? He couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. The ambulance arrived quickly, and the paramedics sprang into action. As they took the baby from his arms, he felt a brief pang of loss, but his professionalism took over. He stood back, allowing the team to do their work, though he couldn't tear his eyes away from the tiny child. Her small chest rose and fell, but there was no denying the fragility in her every movement. "Is she going to be okay?" James asked one of the paramedics, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to do everything we can, Dr. Lawson," the paramedic replied, giving him a reassuring look. "We've got her now." Despite the assurance, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the paramedics loaded the baby into the ambulance, James climbed into the front seat without hesitation. He was her doctor, after all. And right now, he was the only one who could ensure she received the immediate care she needed. The short ride to the hospital felt like an eternity. James sat in silence, his mind a whirl of questions and fears. What kind of life had this baby come from? Why had she been abandoned like this? What had driven her mother, or whoever had left her, to such an extreme? These were questions that could be answered later. For now, he focused on the child, willing her to survive, willing her to make it through this one chance she had. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team was ready. They rushed her into the emergency room, and Dr. Lawson, not wanting to waste a single second, followed close behind. He donned his gloves and joined the team, using his expertise to stabilize the baby's condition. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he pushed through it. It wasn't just the baby's life at stake, it was her future. Hours passed before they were able to stabilize her. They had placed her in an incubator, monitoring her vitals closely. Slowly, but surely, the baby began to respond. Her tiny fingers moved, and her breathing steadied. The crisis had passed, for now. Dr. Lawson stood by her side, exhausted but relieved. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for her. She had no one else. She was alone in the world, and he had found her. He had to ensure she never felt that way again. "I'm not going to leave you," he whispered, his voice breaking as he gazed down at the tiny, sleeping child. "You're not alone anymore." As the night wore on, Dr. Lawson stayed by her side, watching over her like a guardian. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face whatever came their way. This was his responsibility now. Maya was his responsibility. A family begins. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. After the trauma of finding Maya, Dr. James Lawson and his wife, Margaret, felt a deep responsibility to ensure she would have the life she deserved. The hospital staff took great care of Maya, and soon, the tiny infant who had been abandoned in a trash can was showing signs of hope. Her skin, once pale and cold, began to take on a healthy pink hue. Her breathing was steady, and her tiny hands grasped at the soft cloth, swaddling her in a way that made Dr. Lawson's heart swell with emotion. When James first brought the news to Margaret, he was unsure how she would react. Margaret had always dreamed of having a family, but years of trying had left them with empty arms and broken hearts. She had grown used to the idea that they would never be parents, and the possibility of raising a child, especially one with such a painful history, was something she never thought she would face. But Margaret's heart had a special kind of strength, one that had carried her through the ups and downs of their journey together. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table when James walked in, a quiet resolve in his eyes. She looked up from her cup of tea, noting the unusual weight in his demeanor. She could tell something was different. "James, what is it?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you," James said, his voice unsteady. "I found a baby. A little girl. She was abandoned, left in a trash can in the park. Margaret froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. What? A baby? I brought her to the hospital. She was in bad shape, but the doctors say she's stable now. James continued, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. Her name is Maya. For a long moment, Margaret didn't speak. She simply stared at James, as if trying to make sense of what he was saying. The thought of a baby, left to die in such a heartless way, brought tears to her eyes. The pain of that thought washed over her like a wave. Is she okay? Margaret asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. James nodded. She's going to be okay. But she's all alone, Margaret. No family, no one to care for her. And I don't know what to do. I can't just let her go into foster care. I want to help her. I want to give her the life she deserves. Margaret's heart melted as she watched James. She could see the anguish in his eyes, but also the unwavering determination. She could see that he had already made up his mind, even though the reality of this decision hadn't fully set in. She stood up from the table and walked toward James, placing a hand on his shoulder. We'll do it together, James. We'll give her a home. She doesn't deserve to be alone. And neither do we. Tears welled up in James's eyes as he looked at Margaret. Are you sure? Margaret smiled softly. We've been through so much together already. We can do this. We'll give Maya the love and care she needs. And so, that was the beginning of their family, one that neither of them had expected, but both of them would fight for with everything they had. The process of officially adopting Maya was not a simple one. There were many hurdles to overcome. The authorities had to investigate the circumstances surrounding her abandonment, and various social workers were involved in ensuring that James and Margaret were fit to adopt. But as each week passed, they grew more certain that this was meant to be. Maya's place was with them, and they wouldn't let anything stand in their way. The paperwork, legalities, and the necessary background checks took time, but Dr. Lawson's reputation as a doctor, along with their genuine love and commitment to Maya, worked in their favor. After months of waiting, the day finally arrived when they were able to sign the final adoption papers. As James and Margaret stood in front of the adoption official, their hands clasped together tightly, Maya was nestled in Margaret's arms, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her mother's shirt. The moment felt surreal, but at the same time, it felt right. It felt like they had been waiting for Maya their entire lives. You're officially Maya Lawson, the social worker said with a warm smile, pushing the papers toward them. Congratulations, I'm sure you'll be wonderful parents. James and Margaret exchanged a glance, their hearts full of love and gratitude. They knew the road ahead would not be easy. Maya's past would always be a part of her, but they were ready to face whatever challenges came their way. They had already proven that their hearts were strong enough to heal the pain of their own struggles, and now they had the opportunity to help Maya heal too. Raising Maya was, without a doubt, one of the most rewarding experiences of their lives. The first few months were filled with sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, but there was so much joy in the small victories. The first time Maya smiled at them, the first time she reached for James's finger, the first time she said "Mama" and "Dada." These were the moments that made every hardship worth it. As Maya grew, so did her personality. She was a curious and vibrant little girl, eager to explore the world around her. Margaret and James nurtured that curiosity, encouraging her to ask questions, to learn, and to be proud of who she was. Despite the darkness of her past, Maya's spirit was bright and full of life. She had an energy about her that was infectious. One of their favorite memories was the first time they took Maya to the beach. The sand between her toes, the sound of the waves crashing on the shore, and the joy in her eyes as she discovered a world she had never known. It was a memory they would never forget. They had finally given her the childhood she deserved. But as Maya grew older, there were moments when the weight of her history would surface. James and Margaret knew that there would come a time when Maya would ask about her birth mother, about the circumstances of her abandonment. They knew that they couldn't protect her from the truth forever, and they had made a promise to themselves to be honest with her when the time was right. For now, though, they focused on the present. Maya was their daughter, and they were her parents. She belonged with them, and they would do everything in their power to make sure she knew she was loved beyond measure. But as their family grew stronger, there was a shadow on the horizon, one that they couldn't see yet, but that would soon come crashing into their peaceful lives, threatening everything they had fought so hard to create. It was a quiet evening when James received the call. He was sitting at his desk, finishing up some paperwork, when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but James didn't hesitate to answer. "Dr. Lawson." The voice on the other end said, "We need to talk about your daughter, Maya." His blood ran cold. He hadn't expected a call like this. His heart thudded in his chest as he listened to the voice continue. "It's about her biological mother. We've uncovered some disturbing information. You need to know what you're up against." James's mind reeled. What could they have discovered? He had known this day might come, but he wasn't prepared for what he was about to hear. The unraveling. The air in Dr. Lawson's office seemed to thicken, as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath. His fingers gripped the phone tightly, knuckles white, and his heartbeat reverberated in his ears. The voice on the other end of the line, though calm, sent a shiver down his spine. "We've been conducting an investigation into Maya's biological mother," the voice continued, "and we've uncovered some troubling details that you need to be made aware of. You see, Maya's abandonment wasn't an isolated incident, and her mother, well, her history is complicated." James's throat went dry. He knew the child he had rescued had a past that would never be easy to fully understand, but hearing that something more ominous was hidden beneath the surface sent a chill through his bones. The world he had so carefully built for Maya, the sanctuary he and Margaret had lovingly crafted, was suddenly under threat, and James was uncertain of how to fight back against the shadows of the past. "What do you mean by complicated?" James asked, his voice steady despite the growing dread creeping into his chest. "Is she dangerous? What exactly are we looking at here?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and James could almost hear the intake of breath, as though the person on the other end was weighing how much to reveal. "Maya's biological mother, Claire Daniels, has a criminal history, serious charges involving neglect, drug abuse, and even a history of violent behavior. She's been in and out of rehabilitation centers for years. She's had multiple children, all of whom have been removed from her care by social services." The words hit James like a punch in the gut. Claire Daniels, the woman who had abandoned Maya without a second thought, was not only incapable of caring for her own child, but had a history of neglecting other children too. It felt like the world he had been so certain of was disintegrating, piece by piece, right before his eyes. "I don't understand," James murmured, more to himself than to the person on the other end of the line. "How was this never flagged before? Why wasn't I told about this earlier?" The voice on the phone softened, a hint of sympathy threading through. "We only just found out, Dr. Lawson. Maya's case was initially filed under a different name, one that her mother used before she vanished. We were only able to make the connection after some digging. We're sorry we didn't catch this sooner, but we're now gathering more information." James stood up, his legs weak beneath him. He paced back and forth in his office, trying to process the enormity of what he was hearing. The life he and Margaret had created for Maya was built on love and the firm belief that they had given her a fresh start, a chance at a normal, happy childhood. Now it felt as though the rug had been pulled out from under him. "Dr. Lawson." The voice broke into his thoughts. "You need to understand that Maya's biological mother is still out there. We've had reports of her sightings in a few nearby cities. We don't know how far her reach goes, or what her intentions are, but it's important that you be prepared for the possibility that she might come looking for Maya." "Are you saying she's a threat to Maya's safety?" James's voice was barely above a whisper, the weight of the words pressing heavily on his chest. "We're not certain yet," the voice replied, but we strongly recommend that you be vigilant. Keep a close eye on Maya. Make sure she's protected, especially as this investigation unfolds." The line went silent for a moment, and James was left standing there, stunned by the gravity of what he had just heard. He had always known that Maya's past might catch up with her one day, but never had he imagined it would take this form. The woman who had abandoned her, the woman who had failed her so completely, was still a part of Maya's story. And now she was coming back into their lives, a looming shadow threatening everything they had built. James's mind raced. He thought of Margaret, her unwavering support, the way they had embraced Maya as their own from the moment she had come into their lives. Could they protect her from this danger? Could they shield her from the consequences of her mother's mistakes? His heart ached at the thought of what Maya might have to face. After all, how could any child, especially one as innocent as Maya, be expected to confront the darkness of her past? But he couldn't let fear control him. He had made a promise to this little girl, and he would fight for her, no matter what. Later that evening, James sat down with Margaret in their living room, the soft light from the fireplace flickering across their faces. Maya was asleep in her crib, her small, peaceful form a reminder of why they had fought so hard to give her a future. As James explained the phone call to Margaret, his voice faltered with each new revelation. "Her biological mother is still up there," James said quietly, rubbing a hand over his face in frustration. "She has a history of violence, and now it looks like she's been trying to track Maya down." Margaret's expression hardened, the familiar strength in her eyes quickly returning. She leaned forward, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "We won't let her hurt Maya. We'll keep her safe, James. We're her parents now. We've given her everything she needs, and we're not going to let anyone take that away from her." James looked at his wife, seeing the fierce determination that had always made her the person he could rely on through any crisis. But even as he nodded in agreement, doubts lingered in the back of his mind. The woman they were dealing with wasn't just any ordinary threat. Claire Daniels was unpredictable, dangerous, and worst of all, she had a claim to Maya that James and Margaret could never truly erase, no matter how much they loved their daughter. "What if she shows up at the door?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if she tries to take Maya away?" Margaret's gaze softened, but her answer was unwavering. "If she tries, we'll fight for Maya with everything we have. She belongs with us now, and we won't let anyone, not even her biological mother, change that." The next few days were filled with uncertainty. James and Margaret tried to carry on with their daily routines, but the threat of Claire Daniels loomed over everything. James began to make small, subtle changes to their daily life, locking the doors a little more securely at night, keeping an eye on their surroundings when they went out, even taking a different route home from work. But despite their vigilance, there were no signs of Claire Daniels. It was as if she had vanished from the world completely. And yet, the fear remained, simmering beneath the surface. The phone call from the investigator had set everything in motion, but the silence that followed was deafening. Every time James picked up the phone, his heart skipped a beat, half expecting to hear the voice that would bring bad news. Every knock at the door made him jump, his pulse quickening. He couldn't stop thinking about Maya, about how fragile her world had been before they had found her, and how easily it could all come crashing down. As time passed, the feeling of unease began to settle into their bones. They could no longer go about their lives as if everything were normal. Maya was still a child, still in need of their protection, and James and Margaret would do whatever it took to shield her from the dangers that lay ahead. One evening, as James was heading out to the grocery store, he glanced down the street, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. A figure stood across the street from their house, lingering in the shadows. For a moment, James thought it might be a trick of the light. But then the figure moved, and he saw a face that seemed strangely familiar. Claire Daniels. The past had finally come for them, and it was worse than James had feared. The dark truth. James's heart slammed against his chest as his eyes locked on the figure standing across the street. The air seemed to freeze around him, the hum of the quiet evening suddenly becoming deafening. His breath caught in his throat as the woman slowly stepped out of the shadows. The faint glow of the street lamp illuminated her features, and for the first time, James saw the woman who had caused so much havoc in Maya's life. Claire Daniels. Her face was pale, gaunt with the unmistakable mark of someone who had lived a hard, tumultuous life. Her eyes, once soft with the promise of maternal love, were now dark and cold, the glint of something desperate lurking beneath the surface. She didn't belong here. She had no right to be standing outside their home, no right to watch their daughter's life from the shadows. James's hands tightened into fists at his sides, the protective instinct surging within him. He didn't move. He couldn't. His mind raced. What was she doing here? Why now, after all these years, was she resurfacing? Was she planning to take Maya back? His stomach churned with disgust. The thought of Claire Daniels having any claim over Maya made him sick. She had abandoned her, thrown her away like she was nothing. Now, standing there, this woman who had failed Maya in every conceivable way was threatening to pull her back into the darkness from which they had fought so hard to rescue her. For a moment, James considered going straight to the authorities. He could call the police, report the woman who was trespassing and attempting to intrude into their life. But something in the pit of his stomach told him that this wasn't the time for authorities just yet. Claire Daniels was here for a reason, and it was a reason James needed to understand before any drastic decisions were made. He needed to protect Maya, and he couldn't do that without knowing exactly what they were dealing with. James slowly approached the front door, his every step deliberate. His mind was a flurry of thoughts, none of them comforting. He needed to warn Margaret. She deserved to know what was happening, what he had seen, and what Claire Daniels might be planning. As quietly as he could, he moved toward the living room, where Margaret was sitting with her knitting needles, lost in thought. She looked up as he entered, her brow furrowing at the look on his face. "James, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Margaret, stay calm," James began, his voice hushed but filled with urgency. "I saw her. She's here." Margaret's eyes widened, her hands falling still in her lap. "Who? Claire?" James nodded, his jaw clenched. "She's outside, watching our house." Margaret stood up immediately, her face pale, but her expression set with determination. "What should we do? Should we call the police?" James paused. He needed to think clearly. There was something unsettling about the situation, something that made him hesitant to take immediate action without knowing more. "Not yet. I need to talk to her. I need to understand what she wants before we involve anyone else. We have to be sure, Margaret." Margaret looked at him with a mix of disbelief and worry. "James, this woman abandoned Maya. She has no rights to her. If she tries to take Maya, we won't let her. I don't care what she says. We won't let her." James nodded, his resolve matching hers. But he knew that if Claire Daniels wanted Maya, she wouldn't be easily deterred. This wasn't just a fight for a child. This was a fight for the stability and future of the family they had worked so hard to build. Claire had come for something more than just visitation rights or a brief encounter. No, she had come back to claim what she thought was hers, no matter the cost. After a few moments of tense silence, James and Margaret stood together at the window, peering out into the darkened street. Claire Daniels hadn't moved. She was still there, standing across the road with her back to their home, her eyes fixed in their direction, as if she could sense their watchful gaze. "Stay here," James said, his voice firm. "I'll go out and talk to her. I'm not going to let her get close to Maya. I just need to hear her out." Margaret's face tightened in concern, but she didn't argue. She knew this was James's way of protecting the family, by handling things head-on. He wasn't the type to back down. "Be careful, James." "I will," he replied, giving her hand a brief but reassuring squeeze before he slipped out of the door, the cool night air biting at his skin. James walked cautiously toward the sidewalk, his eyes never leaving Claire as he closed the distance between them. She hadn't noticed him approach yet. Her attention was fixed elsewhere, perhaps on the house behind him, or perhaps lost in her own thoughts. But when James was only a few feet away, she turned slowly, locking eyes with him. There was no warmth, no recognition, only a cold, calculating look that sent a shiver down his spine. "James Lawson," she said, her voice like gravel, rough and jagged. "I figured you'd show up eventually." "Claire," James said, keeping his voice steady. "What are you doing here? What do you want?" She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before answering. "I want my daughter back, James. You don't belong with her. You never did." James's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The words she spoke were laced with venom, but there was something else too, something deeper. Beneath the anger in her voice was a rawness, a desperation that couldn't be ignored. James clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. "She's not your daughter anymore, Claire," James said, his voice firm, unyielding. "Maya is ours now. We've given her everything you never could. You abandoned her. You threw her away like she was nothing." Claire's lips twisted into a bitter smile, but there was no humor in it. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't remember the night I left her behind? You think I don't regret what I did?" James's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't back down. "Then why are you here? What do you want from us?" "I want my daughter back," Claire repeated, this time with more force. "You think just because you've been raising her, you have the right to keep her from me. You think that little girl doesn't deserve to know where she came from. She's mine, James. I'll fight you for her if I have to." James's mind raced. He couldn't let her take Maya. He wouldn't. He had fought too hard for this little girl to let her be torn from them now. "You've lost any right to her, Claire," James said through gritted teeth. "You gave up on Maya the day you left her in that trash can. She's a part of our family now, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." For a moment, Claire's face hardened, her gaze narrowing in fury. Then, just as suddenly as the anger had flared, it faded. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for the briefest moment, she looked almost lost. "Do you think she's better off with you?" Claire's voice trembled, a crack forming where the anger had once been. "You think I don't know what I've done? I'm not asking for forgiveness, James, but I deserve to see my daughter. At least once." James's mind churned as he watched Claire. Was this truly remorse, or was it something else? A manipulation, a last attempt to assert some kind of control over a situation she had long since abandoned. He didn't have the answers, but what he did know with certainty was that Maya was his daughter now, and he would protect her, no matter what. James took a deep breath, steadying himself. "You can't have her, Claire. You don't get to come back into her life after everything you've done. You don't get to take her from us. She's better off without you." Claire didn't respond at first. She only looked at him, her eyes empty of hope but full of something darker, something that made James uneasy. "You'll regret this," she finally muttered, before turning away, disappearing back into the shadows. James stood frozen for a moment, watching her retreat, before turning back toward his home. He knew that this wasn't over. It couldn't be. Claire Daniels would stop at nothing to reclaim what she thought was hers, and James wasn't prepared to let that happen. As he re-entered the house, Margaret was waiting, her eyes wide with concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. James shook his head. "She's gone. But this isn't over. We've just begun a fight we never saw coming." The silence in the room grew heavy as they both realized the truth. Their peaceful world was no longer safe. The past had caught up with them, and there would be no easy way out. Shadows of the past. Days passed, but the unease that had settled in the Lawson household didn't dissipate. If anything, it deepened, sinking its roots further into their lives. Every creak of the floorboards, every car that drove by, every knock at the door set James's nerves on edge. It wasn't the peaceful life they had fought for. Not anymore. It was a life filled with uncertainty, shadows lurking at every corner. Margaret had tried to maintain normalcy, insisting that Maya needed to be shielded from the growing tension. They went on outings, kept up with their routines, and even shared quiet moments at night after Maya had gone to bed. But beneath the surface, both of them knew that the peace they had once taken for granted had been shattered. James couldn't escape the thoughts that weighed heavily on his mind. After the encounter with Claire Daniels, he had expected her to disappear back into the obscurity from which she had emerged. But that didn't happen. She had left a lingering imprint on their lives, like a storm that hadn't yet fully passed. The call came on a Thursday evening. James had just finished dinner when his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, the kind he had learned to approach cautiously since Claire had resurfaced. He didn't even hesitate before answering. "Hello." His voice was steady, but his heart raced. "Dr. Lawson." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the tone was calm, almost clinical. "My name is Detective Rachel Cole. I'm with the local police department. We need to discuss an urgent matter regarding Maya Daniels." James's breath caught in his throat. His heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out across his brow. "What's happened? Is she okay?" There was a long pause before the detective spoke again, her voice grave. "It's not Maya we're concerned about right now. We've just uncovered new information. It seems that Claire Daniels has become a person of interest in a string of criminal activities across the state. We believe she may be linked to a much larger network of individuals. You need to understand that this could be much more dangerous than we originally thought." James felt the world around him tilt, his vision blurring momentarily as the weight of the detective's words sank in. "What are you saying? What does this have to do with Maya?" "There are concerns about Maya's safety, Dr. Lawson," Detective Cole continued. "Claire Daniels has a history of connections with people who aren't exactly law-abiding. Some of these individuals may have ties to human trafficking rings. We're still investigating, but we're concerned that Maya might be at risk." James was silent for a moment, processing the information. His mind reeled. Claire Daniels had never been a stranger to criminal activity. He knew that much. But to hear that Maya's biological mother was potentially involved in something so insidious sent a shock of horror through him. "We need to bring Maya in for questioning," the detective added, "to verify her identity and ensure she's not being targeted by people connected to her biological mother." James's blood ran cold. He was no longer concerned with just Claire Daniels. The scope of the threat had broadened, and now it was no longer just about a mother trying to reclaim her child. It was about something much darker, and James knew that if they didn't act quickly, Maya could be caught in the crossfire. Margaret had overheard part of the conversation from the kitchen, and when James hung up, he turned to find her standing in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice tight. "They're saying Maya could be in danger," James said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm. "Claire is involved with something far worse than we thought, something dangerous. There are people who might be after Maya." Margaret's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in fear. "What kind of people? What are we supposed to do?" James walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "We need to protect her, Margaret. We need to keep her safe, no matter what it takes." Margaret nodded, her face resolute, but the uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her fear. "I don't care what Claire Daniels or anyone else does. We've given Maya a home, a life, and they won't take that away from us. We will keep her safe." The strength in Margaret's words soothed James for only a moment before reality set back in. The phone call had shaken him, but it had also illuminated the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about dealing with an unstable mother. This was about a criminal network, a potentially violent force that might stop at nothing to get to Maya, to use her as leverage or worse. The next day, James took Maya to the park, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for her. She ran ahead, her laughter filling the air as she chased after a butterfly. To any passerby, It looked like a typical day in the park, nothing out of the ordinary. But James couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching. His eyes flicked nervously over his shoulder, scanning the crowd, looking for anything that might give away the danger that was lurking in the shadows. Margaret stayed home, but she was on high alert, checking the locks, watching out the windows, and keeping her phone close in case there was any news from the detective. Hours passed, but the nagging feeling in James's gut refused to let up. Finally, as the sun began to set, he decided it was time to head back. He bent down, picking up Maya, and together they walked back to the car. Maya chattered excitedly about the butterfly she had chased, oblivious to the silent tension that clung to her father's every step. As they pulled into the driveway, James's phone rang again. He didn't recognize the number, but his heart jumped in his chest. "Hello, Dr. Lawson, it's Detective Cole again. I'm afraid we've got some disturbing news. Claire Daniels is missing. We believe she might have disappeared into a network of criminals who are known for their ability to hide in plain sight. We think she's planning something involving Maya." James's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" "The people she's involved with. They don't just take children. They control them, manipulate them. We think they may be planning to use Maya as a pawn, leverage for whatever their next move is. We need your help to track her down." James's pulse quickened, his thoughts racing. He thought of the peaceful life he and Margaret had created for Maya, the life they had built with so much love and sacrifice. Now it seemed as though everything they had worked for was teetering on the edge of collapse. "We'll do whatever it takes to protect her," James said, his voice resolute, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I'm going to need you to stay vigilant, Dr. Lawson. I'll be in touch soon. But right now, I need you to get Maya somewhere safe. Don't let her out of your sight." James glanced over at Maya, who was now sitting in the back seat, happily playing with her toy. He could see the innocence in her eyes, the same innocence that had been so brutally stolen from her when she was abandoned by her mother. Now that innocence was threatened again, this time by forces far beyond what he could have ever imagined. "I will," James said. "I won't let anyone take her." That night, James and Margaret sat together in the living room, Maya sleeping soundly in her bed. They held each other close, finding comfort in the presence of one another, but both of them knew that they were on the edge of something much darker. Claire Daniels had returned, but the true danger had yet to be revealed. The breaking point. The morning came, but the dark cloud that had settled over the Lawson household refused to lift. James woke before dawn, his mind racing with thoughts of the conversation he'd had with Detective Cole the night before. His heart ached with the weight of what was unfolding. The uncertainty, the fear, the looming threat to Maya's safety. It felt like their world was about to unravel. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cold in his hands as he stared out the window, barely noticing the rising sun. Margaret had already gotten up, and as always, she was doing her best to keep everything together. But he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the silent worry she carried with her. She, too, was feeling the weight of it all, though she tried to shield Maya from it. James knew he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. He had promised to protect Maya, to keep her safe, but the challenge ahead was unlike anything they had faced before. The dark world of crime that Claire Daniels had been involved with was far-reaching, dangerous, and calculating. And if they weren't careful, Maya could be caught in the middle. The phone rang again, cutting through the silence of the morning. This time, it was an unfamiliar number, one that James recognized immediately. Detective Cole. "Dr. Lawson," the detective's voice crackled through the receiver, tight with urgency. "We have a lead. We've traced Claire Daniels to a location about 2 hours outside the city. It seems she's been hiding out with a group of individuals connected to a trafficking syndicate. We need to move quickly." James's stomach dropped. He glanced at Margaret, who had been silently watching him, her eyes full of questions. "What is it?" she asked softly. James's expression darkened. It's Claire. They found her. She's connected to some dangerous people. We have to go now." Margaret's face went pale, but there was no hesitation in her voice when she spoke. "Let's go. We can't wait any longer." The drive to the location felt like a blur. Every minute felt like an eternity. James's mind raced with thoughts of what might be happening, what they might find when they arrived. They couldn't afford to waste any time. This wasn't just about confronting Claire Daniels anymore. It was about taking Maya out of harm's way, about ensuring that she didn't become a pawn in a much larger, much darker game. The location Detective Cole had mentioned was an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The area had been shut down for years, but it was clear from the detective's report that it had become a hideout for Claire and the dangerous people she had become entangled with. When they arrived, James felt a knot tighten in his chest. There were no signs of life at first, just an old, dilapidated building with broken windows and a sagging roof. But something about it felt wrong, like the stillness was a mask for something far more sinister. He could sense the danger, feel the heaviness in the air. They parked a few blocks away and made their way to the warehouse on foot, careful to avoid drawing attention. James's hand clenched around the handle of the flashlight he had brought with him, the beam cutting through the darkness. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, as if the world around him was holding its breath. Inside the warehouse, the sound of their footsteps echoed ominously off the concrete walls. It was eerily quiet. The air smelled of dust and rust, and the distant hum of the city seemed miles away, swallowed up by the cavernous space. As they ventured deeper into the heart of the building, James's mind whirled with thoughts of what might lie ahead. The stakes had never been higher. They weren't just trying to protect their daughter from an unstable mother anymore. They were up against a dangerous network that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. They'd reached the back of the warehouse, where the flickering light of a solitary lamp revealed a scene that made James's blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, sitting on a pile of discarded crates, was Claire. She was watching them with vacant eyes, her body tense, as though she were waiting for something, or someone, to happen. There was no sign of Maya. "Claire," James called out, his voice sharp, demanding. "Where is she?" Claire's eyes narrowed as she lifted her head slightly, her lips twisting into a mocking smile. "You think you can save her?" she asked, her voice cold and empty. "You don't know anything about what's really going on here." Margaret stepped forward, her face filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "What have you done with Maya? What have you gotten her involved in?" Claire laughed, but it wasn't a sound of amusement. It was something darker, more sinister. "Maya's part of something much bigger than you'll ever understand. You've given her a false sense of safety, thinking you've rescued her, but you have no idea what you're up against. She's not your daughter. She's mine. And if you think you can protect her from the people I'm connected to, you're wrong." James stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You're not her mother anymore, Claire. You gave that up the moment you abandoned her. She's ours. And I swear, if you've hurt her." Before James could finish his sentence, there was a sudden movement from the shadows, and James's heart skipped a beat. A man emerged from the darkness, tall and imposing, with a hard, cold stare. He was followed by two more men, all of them dressed in dark, tactical gear. They were armed. Claire's expression shifted. She leaned back against the crates, almost as if she had been expecting this. "You should have stayed out of this, James," she said softly, almost apologetically. "Now, you're going to pay the price." James's body tensed, and he instinctively moved in front of Margaret, his eyes darting to the men who had appeared from nowhere. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. These men, whoever they were part of the same criminal syndicate that had ensnared her, and now they were going to use her against them. "We're taking Maya." The leader of the men spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "And there's nothing you can do to stop us." James's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. He couldn't let them take Maya, not after everything they'd been through. But he was outnumbered and outgunned. The odds were stacked against him. Then, just as the tension was about to snap, a loud, urgent noise came from the far side of the warehouse, a door slamming open. It was Detective Cole and her team. "Freeze," the detective shouted, her voice commanding. "Put down your weapons." In a split second, chaos erupted. The men moved to draw their guns, but they were met with the flashing light of the detectives' team, who were quickly closing in on their position. There was a blur of movement, the sound of shouting, and the sharp crack of gunshots that echoed through the warehouse. But amidst the commotion, James's eyes locked onto the figure in the corner, the figure he had been dreading to see. Maya. She was there, wide-eyed and terrified, crouched behind a stack of boxes. She hadn't been hurt, but the fear in her eyes was enough to send James's heart into overdrive. He rushed toward her, his legs carrying him faster than he ever thought possible, his arms reaching out to pull her into his embrace. "Maya," James breathed, his voice hoarse with relief. "You're okay. You're safe now." Maya clung to him, her small body trembling in his arms. She didn't say anything, just held on as if her life depended on it. And for a moment, in that small corner of the warehouse, with the sounds of the police closing in on the criminals surrounding them, it felt like the world had finally stopped spinning. But James knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The fight wasn't just for Maya's safety. It was for their future, and for the chance to give her the life she deserved, free from the past, and free from the darkness that had once tried to claim her.